I don't have to introduce myself. I'm going to say this was supposed to be Rabbi Miriam Margles was going to do all this introduction. Miriam unfortunately got delayed on a flight back home, and so I'm introducing myself. But you know who I am, so I'm not going to introduce me. I'm going to skip to introducing Sarah. Sarah Hurwitz is our very special guest star tonight. After years of crafting speeches for President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, Sarah applied her gifts as a writer to describing her transformative journey into Jewish identity on her own terms in her first book, Here All Along. Sarah's latest book is As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Blame, Shame, and Try to Erase Us, which was published in September by Harper One. So welcome, Sarah. You are encouraged to ask questions during today's event. To do so, on the bottom of your screen, there's a More button, and you can see there when you click on that, you'll see Q&A, and that's where you can submit questions. Those will then be collated and fed to me, and we can and we'll try to get as many of those in as we can. All right, that's where we are. So welcome, Sarah. So glad to have you here. Hi.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here. I love IJS. I've done retreats and classes with IJS. I have so many faculty and friends who work at IJS, and it is really just an honor and such a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me.
And I didn't, in your intro, I didn't say, and Sarah's a member of our advisory council, which is, she is a wonderful advisor and a friend. And so, yeah. And in a historical nugget, Sarah, 6 years ago, your
Yeah.
first book that we mentioned here all along was
Yeah.
actually the very first talk that we did in this series. Because
Really?
yes,
Oh,
COVID had just hit, and you and I were
yeah.
talking, and you were like, I've got this book and my whole book tour just got canceled. And I said, wait, I've got a Zoom audience. We could like do something together. So we did a book talk
Wow.
on Zoom and a bunch of people came. And here we are 6 years later, and you've written another book and now a bunch of people came. So I want to invite you to answer the question, like what led you to write As a Jew and how is it different than Here All Along?
Yeah, so Here All Along is this very warm, enthusiastic love letter to Jewish tradition. And I think my second book, As a Jew, it's much more of a polemic. And what really inspired it was that, after I published my first book, and as you recalled, there was the pandemic, so my book tour got canceled. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I decided to train to be a volunteer hospital chaplain. And I just want to pause on the word chaplain, right? Like that's a Christian word. And I actually wasn't even sure people who weren't Christian could do chaplaincy because the word is Christian, but they can. It's actually open to people of all traditions. But that is really in a microcosm kind of representative of what it is like to be a minority religion tradition in America today, which is, it's a majority Christian country. And so I started doing chaplaincy, and I was getting into weird fights with my instructors about things like prayer is, God, please heal my friend Josh. He's right here. He can hear me. I'm praying out loud, and I am doing this spontaneously from my heart with no ancient scripted prayer before me. This is just I'm making this up, and it's beautiful. That is a lovely way to pray. And of course, Jews can and do pray that way. But I wouldn't say that's the most common form of Jewish prayer. And I wouldn't necessarily just kind of lead with that if I were dealing with a Jewish patient. But my instructors were like, no, that is prayer. It is universal. That's how people pray. And I do remember my Muslim classmate being like, I'm not sure. They're like, it's prayer. It's like, oh, okay, I guess that's what we're doing here. Um, I came to realize just how much I had kind of grown up thinking in Christian language, images, ideas, even the idea of spirituality, that our bodies are somehow degraded, inferior, carnal, bad, and there is a superior, good, immaterial spirit world, and there's a duality there. And the goal is to escape this carnal sort of meat envelope for this heavenly spiritual realm. That's not really a central Jewish idea, but I just thought that's spirituality. So I really began to reflect on how Christianity had kind of infiltrated my Jewish identity. The second thing that inspired my book is that in the wake of the 2021 Israel-Gaza war, I started just noticing online some just a real rhetoric around Israel and Zionism and Jews that was increasingly hateful and extreme and dogmatic. And it made me very, very anxious because, I've been very much focused on anti-Semitism from one part of the political spectrum, which we were seeing in 2015, 16, 17. And now this rhetoric was coming from my part of the political spectrum, from the left. And I just thought like, oh boy, something is going on here that's troubling and I need to look into. And the final thing that inspired my book is that I visited a college, Hillel, the Jewish student organization, in 2022. And the students kept asking me, how did you deal with anti-Semitism when you were in college? And I was so stunned. And I kept saying, like, I didn't ever, not once in the 90s. And they didn't believe me. Like it didn't land for them. And I thought, okay, something is happening here. And, with all this time on my hands, I really started reflecting on my Jewish identity for most of my childhood and young adult life, which was I'm Jewish, but not that Jewish. It's all one word, one long word. I'm just a fill in the blank. I'm just a cultural Jew. I'm just a social justice Jew. I'm not like those other Jews who are so Jewy. But like, what if I was like them? What if there weren't the caveats or apologies or explanations? What if I were just a Jew? Why did I want to reassure people that I wasn't too Jewish for them? What was up with that? And so writing this book was really where I grappled with many centuries of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred that has very much, I think, infiltrated and warped my Jewish identity and I think the identity of many Jews. And I really wrestle with how do we peel away all of those layers of shame, self-hatred, internalized anti-Semitism so that we can turn back to our tradition with open-heartedness, not seeing it through the gaze of those who persecute us, but through our own loving, awe-filled, reverent, curious gaze.
Mm. I remember a couple of years ago, you and I had coffee. I think you were visiting here in
Mm.
at Northwestern,
Yeah.
and I live in Skokie, a few miles away, and I remember we were talking about this question of, going to college in the 1990s and like, how that operated. And I remember now, I hadn't thought of this, but I think I shared with you that when I decided to wear a kippah full time, I remember totally exactly where it was. And it was my sophomore year of college and deciding, when I left the Hillel building, I was tired of how far did I have to be from the Hillel building to take my kippah off. And when I
Right.
decided to like wear it all the time, I remember it had zero, like, there was nothing to do with what the non-Jews were going to think. It was all about what the Jews would think, right? Like that was what
It's
motivated. And
well,
like, and here 30 years later,
times have
it's
changed,
such a
my
different
friend.
world. It's such a
Yes.
different world.
Yes.
Um, so, uh, so you mentioned October 7th, and I'll share that like a couple of years ago now, it was a few months after October 7th, and I was having a meeting with one of our longtime funders, and I was asking like, what are you noticing as unmet needs in the community? And we were talking about like the very reactive way that anti-Semitism response seems to appear. We combat, we fight, we stand with, we stand against. And this funder said, is anyone doing anything to develop like a more trauma-informed response to anti-Semitism? Because like everybody's feeling very traumatized. And I was like, yeah, like we could do that. And we ultimately got a wonderful grant to help us develop that. I mentioned actually one of the manifestations is that class that Rabbi Miriam Margles is teaching.
Mm.
And and really it's about, how we can use Jewish mindfulness to help us all respond better to anti-Semitism. And I feel like you've written something, this book is sort of in service of that too. I actually think it's kind of the heart of the book. So I want to invite you, and this may be a long answer, but like, how do you see the dynamics of trauma playing out for us now, like individually and collectively when it comes to anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism?
Yes. I think that is such an astute question, especially the piece of intergenerational trauma. And I think it's so important. And the problem is that as American Jews, for most of us, our anti-Semitism education is Holocaust education, which goes something like, the Germans lost World War I, blame the Jews. There was a depression, they blamed the Jews, and then they murdered them. Why? Because of prejudice and scapegoating. And if you were to ask, but why the Jews in particular? It's like because of prejudice and scapegoating. That's what we're learning about here in eighth grade, prejudice and scapegoating. And the reality is that's not the answer, right? The answer to the question, why the Jews, why the Holocaust, is 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism, which led to the thinking that led to the Holocaust. And that is the work of generations of renowned Christian scholars, many of whose work I know you're familiar with. It is also the work of all the major Christian denominations, particularly the Catholic Church, which in recent decades have done profound work on taking responsibility for this history, on owning it, on naming it, on really trying to sort of, move on from it and disavow it. And I think it's very important for us to know that. But without knowing that history, I think we are very confused about the trauma we face because it seems like, well, no, it was kind of a one-off in the mid 20th century and now never again, but it's happening again. And why is that? We need to understand, of course, there is pagan anti-Semitism before Christianity. It was a form of, most scholars seem to view it as a form of xenophobia. Jews eat weird foods, have this Shabbat thing, won't worship our God, but our gods, plural, that is. But Christianity really wound up theologizing that. And you have the New Testament where you have two groups of Jews arguing. There's all Jews here, but they eventually part ways. Some remain Jews, some become Christians. And early Christianity, unfortunately, some early Christian leaders really sought to define Christianity against Judaism. And what you have is the development of three very anti-Jewish themes about the Jewish people, which is number one, they are diabolically, preternaturally, supernaturally powerful and disgustingly, dangerously depraved. So much so that they convinced their Roman occupiers to kill God's son. And there might not be many of them, but they get together in a conspiracy behind the scenes and pull the levers of power and do great evil. So you see these themes of power, depravity, conspiracy working their way through the Western tradition, as a brilliant scholar named David Nirenberg, who we were talking about before, has brilliantly elucidated in his book, Anti-Judaism. Is the Muslim world, Islam had its own anti-Jewish and anti-Christian ideas, but Jews and Christians were not central to Islam the way that Jews were central to Christianity. It was more of a, Jews and Christians as second-class citizens, as sort of thought of as sort of pathetic, weak. It was kind of a Jim Crow situation of looking down on them. But unfortunately, with colonization, as Christianity made its way into the Muslim world, you have these ideas that begin to take root about Jewish power and depravity and conspiracy, especially with regard to Israel. And you see this in the modern Islamist forms of anti-Semitism. The Soviets, too, got in on this action. Similar power, depravity, conspiracy, but the problem was, of course, not the Jews, because God forbid Nazis hated Jews, and the Nazis were the Soviets' enemies. The problem was not the Jews, it was the Zionists, which that now has been pioneered, very, very common on a college campus near you, if you want to really dig into that. That's not like just prejudice and scapegoating. That is actually a very specific historical and theological lineage that we need to know about to understand what we are seeing today. And I will say our response to that is also really important to understand, particularly in 19th century Europe. And now let's be clear, many Jews do not have roots in 19th century Europe. Their roots are in Africa and Asia, and that was a very different history and response. But the history of Western and Eastern Europe as well, it's very important to American Jews because so many of us have roots in Europe. And it's important for us to understand that as people were offered the rights of citizenship in modern European nation states that were developing, Jews were a problem because Jews had lived in these insular communities. They lived by Jewish law, ate Jewish food, spoke Jewish languages. And the question was, wait a second, how can these people be Frenchmen and Germans? They're Jews. They're their own nation. And Jews wanted the rights of citizenship. They wanted to go to universities. They wanted to get jobs. And so there really was this effort in the early 1800s to reimagine Judaism as this Protestant style religion. The idea was like, they have a church, we have a Jewish church. It even has stained glass like their church. We're going to make it look like theirs. They worship God in their church. We worship God in ours. They have the Old Testament. So do we. In fact, we invented it, fortunately. And we're really going to lean into prophetic morality and this kind of like very enlightened, classy, civilized kind of religion. The problem is that the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, like that's the beginning of the Jewish textual tradition. It is not the end. That was followed by 2,500 years of our ancestors grappling with the most important aspects of human existence, what it means to be human and to be a good person and to walk in the world. And what is heartbreaking to me is that we radically de-emphasized that 2,500 years of our tradition in order to be accepted and safe. And I have such compassion for my ancestors who did this. That was the price they had to pay for the opportunities I take for granted today. And I also admire them. That was actually a very brave thing to do because they could have just converted. They could have just been nothing, but they said, no, we want to remain Jews. But that came at a very steep cost, a cost of a real erasure of real spiritual loss. And I was telling a bunch of Israelis about this, and one of them kept interrupting me and saying, this happened to us too. And I kept saying, no, it didn't. I don't know what you're talking about. And then I stopped and I thought, oh my gosh, he is right. If you look at if you look at the early Zionists, some of them, they are as negative about traditional Jewish religion as these early reformers in 1800s Western Europe. These early Zionists, some of them were like, our rabbis are teaching us superstitious nonsense that's getting us killed. We have to leave this behind and become these muscular, secular Israelis. And by the way, the Jews who embraced communism and socialism, they too disdained religion. It got in the way of the brotherhood of man. It was the opiate of the masses. So many of us underwent this terrible tragedy that I think, frankly, we're still dealing with the fallout of today. But what I find really inspiring is that I think in recent decades, you've seen so many scholars, rabbis, organizations, just ordinary Jews doing the work of reclaiming this tradition, doing the work
Mm.
of saying, wait a second, no, we're gonna go back and look through our texts and our traditions, and we are going to repurpose, reclaim, reimagine, reown this. And that is really the work of IJS in so many ways. I look at all your classes, I look at what you're doing, it's that work. And so I
Mm.
think the trauma of all of that, both the persecution and the spiritual erasure, it's deep, it's old, and we are really grappling with it, and it's very, very big.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot there. Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to remind folks if you want to ask a question, there's a few that have come in. If you want to ask a question, please just use the Q&A button. That's if you can't see it, click on more and you'll find it. And you can submit a question there. Um, so I guess as a follow-up to that, um, your first book, I felt like in your first book, I don't, somebody else must have said this, but I've said it a lot. I know that in your first book, it felt like you were kind of doing for Judaism what you had done for the Obamas. Like you were taking these big, lofty concepts and translating them into language that people can understand. And you were doing that on behalf of Judaism, right? And that's the work of a White House speechwriter. And it seems to me that this book is very much part of that project. And it's a different kind of translation. And in any translation work, there is always the potential that you don't get the words quite right. And I imagine you might have struggled with that, like throughout your career, including, there was some tension that followed the public conversation at the GA this year, a couple of months ago. I don't want to go back into that, but I do want to invite you, if you'd like, to reflect on the challenge of writing, speaking, translating, communicating with an audience, whether your client, as it were, is the First Lady or Jewish life.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. This is very much something that I saw in politics, particularly most recently writing speeches for Michelle Obama. I joined her in the 2008 campaign where she was just getting barraged with this incredibly ugly, hateful narrative of angry Black woman who does not love America. I really think that was the result of a tremendous amount of racism and sexism. And, when I first met her, I just thought, wow, this woman could not be more different from that, reductive, just dehumanizing stereotype. She is someone who is brilliant and kind and thoughtful and wise and decent and deeply patriotic. And she's quite an extraordinary human being, as you all got to see for 8 years in the White House and beyond. And it was just painful to see her flattened into a stereotype. And, the way that I dealt with that as I wrote, for her and that I've dealt with as I've written for many people, being so aware of how easy it is for someone to be misunderstood. I did a lot of really anxious triple and quadruple checking. In the White House, you run speeches by dozens of people. I've hounded many lawyers, policy people, communications advisors to just check and check and check to kind of try to protect her from that. And, I will say that since I worked for her over the past decade, the media landscape has only really gotten more dehumanizing, I think, with social media. And mindfulness, I believe, is very relevant here because, it teaches us to actually, instead of responding, reacting, and creating a story around a stimulus, to actually pause and notice it. I think if you're doing a meditation sit and you notice a pain in your knee, you could kind of devolve into, oh no, what if there's something wrong? And what if I need surgery? And what if I have to miss work? And what if I lose my job? It's like, okay. Or you could see, a 1 minute video of a politician saying something that you disagree with, and you could say, wow, they're wrong. In fact, I think they're ignorant and bigoted. In fact, I think that they are going to destroy our country and are dangerous and a threat. But, what if instead we just paused and just noticed what was happening in our bodies? right? Just notice like, oh, there's some pain in my knee. Okay, let's get curious. Like, what does that pain feel like? Let's actually just kind of watch that pain as it does its thing, right? Every sensation in our bodies evolves if you actually sit and watch it. What if we watched that video of that politician and thought like, huh, okay, that really hurt me. I'm really angry by that, about that. Let me do some research. Let me actually learn a little bit more about this person, about what they think, about what their views are. Let me just get the full picture here. And look, maybe you do need knee surgery. It's possible. Maybe that politician actually is someone who's doing real harm, who you need to protest. That could happen. But it's possible that maybe that person's views are a little bit more complicated than what you first saw, and that maybe actually they have some points that even if you disagree with them might be worth considering. So I think that mindfulness, this practice, is really so helpful for dealing with exactly this kind of challenge. I'll also just say we have some really beautiful mindful wisdom in our tradition, in our texts. I think that so often we have this idea you see a lot on in the modern media landscape of, I'm going to scream my one dogmatic truth from the hilltops, and anyone agrees who disagrees with me is fill in the blank terrible slur. But Jewish tradition, that's just not a Jewish way of thought. Jewish tradition operates in polarities. Our rabbis, for centuries and centuries, they're always holding opposing truths. Our texts are always holding opposing truths. So read the Torah. It tells us no fewer than 36 times, love the stranger, welcome the stranger. The stranger is the non-Israelite, the non-Jew. You have to welcome them and love them and care for them. It also tells us, remember Amalek, remember the tribe of the Amalekites, who were the enemies of the Israelites, attacked them from behind and were very brutal. So love the stranger, and also remember that some strangers want to kill you. You got to hold both those poles. And I think that is, rather than imposing a story or imposing a reaction on something, that's actually really stepping back and getting clear about what is, actually noticing the complexity, the plurality, everything that's around you. That is, I think, a key mindfulness technique. And the last thing I'll say in answer to this question is, I think there is, a lot of the kind of anti-Judaism that bothered me most was the old anti-Jewish lie that, while Christianity is a religion of love, Judaism is a religion of law. Nitpicky, weedy, bad. Rabbi Sheiheldt has written an entire brilliant book refuting this claim and just decimating it. But what I'll say is that in our nitpicky, weedy, endless hypotheticals that our rabbis are grappling with is such a high standard of love. When they're dictating this very, very kind of nitpicky little rule that says that if you've loaned money to someone and 3 weeks later you see them coming down the street towards you and you know they can't afford to repay you, you should actually turn the other way so you don't run into them. It's like, real seriously, you can't just say help the poor and let people figure it out. Like or like, if you're in a store and have no intention of buying anything, don't ask the price of an item because you'll waste the shopkeeper's time and get their hopes up. Like, can't just say be kind to workers. Like, just love people. How hard is it? But that is actually Jewish tradition trying to get you to actually mindfully notice what or who is in front of you, right? Saying, put yourself in that shopkeeper's feet, put yourself in the shoes of that person who's really financially struggling and might be humiliated by you running into them and reminding them that they're indebted to you. It is like going to the eye doctor and they just click that vision machine finer and finer to get your vision to really see this person in front of you. And I think so much of our modern discourse of, no, we're just going to break people up into these dehumanizing labels and categories. Powerful, powerless, oppressor, oppressed, love, hate, done. That's just clicking the vision machine backwards. That's not mindful and it's in no way Jewish. So I think our tradition offers a lot that is countercultural and useful today.
Yeah. Um, it's a beautiful reflection because also like I think even and it's interesting going back to some of the previous conversations, some of the ways that um, some of that anti-Jewish argument caricature affects our own self-perception, right? It's
Yes,
like
exactly.
I remember, I mean,
Exactly.
20 years ago, I remember 20 years ago, we were starting a new student magazine at Northwestern, a Jewish magazine.
Okay.
Um, and and I remember the founding group like wanted the tagline to it was something about, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like when they were talking about what the personality of the magazine was going to be, it was like, it's going to be Jewy, but not Talmudic. And I'm like, what do you mean not Talmudic?
It's
Like not Talmudic.
yikes.
It's almost
Yikes.
beautiful. I mean, yeah, there are parts that can be annoying, but there are parts
Of
that are really
course.
fantastic. Anyway, and so, but I think that that gaze has
Yeah.
clearly had an internal effect on us as well. And you're
Yes.
reminding us, one of the best things that I've read in the last 10 years is an essay by Ariel Mays, Rabbi Dr.
Mm,
Ariel Mays,
sure.
about halacha as a neo-Hasidic halacha, approach to halacha. And when he points out, he starts this essay by talking about when he's like 16 years old on a mountaintop in California doing his black belt exam in karate, right? And that the discipline, the embodied discipline that's required to reach that level, right, is analogous in many ways to the embodied discipline that is halacha. Like these are ways of using one's body in, divine service and devotion, etc. And so, I think you're reminding us and inviting us like to think about that. So that being said, and that was also my way of giving you a chance to rest your voice. I also want to, I want to ask, you told me the other day you just got back from a week-long retreat with Or Halev, one of our wonderful partner organizations. Um, and I'm wondering if you could just speak a little more personally about how your own experience with mindfulness helps you grapple with, like those big challenges that you talked about, especially in the media public environment that we live in today, that you live in today,
Great.
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I did just go to this retreat and it was just an extraordinary experience. If you can make it work, it is such a gift to go on retreat. IJS has many excellent retreats. I've done many excellent retreats with IJS. And I think what was so powerful about this was it was a space where I was not analyzing, fixing, solving, acting, responding, but rather just like being with. And I think it made me realize that, just the challenge of, you know, being in public, speaking in public, it is, you can run into some difficulties. And, I think the way that and I think many other people in this line of work deal with that is by kind of compartmentalizing, by kind of hardening, which is super helpful in the moment. It keeps you from falling apart when there's a crisis or something's going on. It lets you make rational decisions. It makes people think that you're really tough and you can handle it, which I kind of liked. I liked being thought of that way. Wasn't true. But I think that hardness and compartmentalizing really does come at a cost, especially once you've gotten beyond the challenge or the crisis and you're still in that kind of like hardened and frozen mode, which, it does protect you from things like fear and grief, but it also protects you from things like joy and connection. And that's kind of the struggle. And I think that, in this container of a retreat with these really incredibly compassionate and skilled teachers whom I just adore, I think it at least allowed me, in my experience, to just start confronting some of the fear that I still feel. I think it gave me some space for some grief that I hadn't really had the time or the space to feel. And, really just stepping back, it made me realize how it's like very easy to go about your life kind of knowing and feeling like you're almost living outside of your own home. Like you're kind of standing outside, and for whatever reason, you just don't really have the keys to get in. Like, there are feelings you need to feel. There are things that you are just like not confronting, that you're kind of checked out of, but you just cannot figure out a way in. And I think in recent months, I've just found myself wishing like someone would just like show up and be like, oh, I used to own this model of house. Actually, there's a side door. I can just show you that. Or like, there's actually this window that's shatterproof glass. We can just like pop it out, get you in there. And I have to say, I think that the combination of the really like intense practice and quiet container of retreat with just some truly extraordinary teachers who, took some real time with me to kind of like walk me through was just tremendously helpful. And I do, I'll end by saying I also think, community is incredibly important. I think I've been reflecting, especially over this past week, on just the number of people who picked up the phone, who, answered my calls, my emails, my texts, in this just no questions asked. What am I doing? How am I helping you? Like, what do you need? I'm here. People who some of these people weren't even my closest friends, but they were, people who I really admire in our community who just stepped up. And, I think Jewish liturgy is very impressive. There are so many words, which, as someone recently said, is why our services are so insufferably and excruciatingly long. Much respect for that, but I think oftentimes the best prayers are the most elemental. I don't know, thank you. And for me, just stay with me is a very elemental and basic prayer. And I think that, the last, just having this time and space on retreat made me realize like how many people had kind of answered that prayer for me, had just like stayed with me, whether it was teachers staying with me on retreat or folks who just supported me. And I'm there was a lot of space for just a tremendous amount of gratitude. So as you can tell, I'm a big fan of the week-long retreat. I've done about 27 of them. I've assistant taught on several, and I just can't recommend them highly enough.
Mm. Um, we'll use that as a blurb in future social media promotions. Uh, you heard it here first. One of the things that happened between your last book and this one, you mentioned before in talking about how the book came to be, is that you became a chaplain who works in hospitals. And that shows up in the book frequently. I'm not sure how many other White House speechwriters have followed that career path. Uh,
Yeah, it's,
and
it's
and
unusual.
so I know a number of lawyers. I do know a number of attorneys who have become chaplains later in life. But I think folks here, I imagine, would love to hear more about what led you to chaplaincy and
Yeah.
how it has impacted your practice of Judaism and Jewish mindfulness.
Yeah. I didn't even know what chaplaincy was until COVID. And when I found out that it was being really radically present with people in the most difficult moments of their lives, and you can do it in hospitals, I just felt like, oh, this is what I want. Because I love hospitals. Like I loved being by my grandmother's bedside at the end of her life and holding her hands and being with her and just really watching this team of people whose whole job was the project of care for other human beings. And I really thought like this is something I want to do. And, I will say it is such a countercultural kind of activity because in our modern secular society, we are just horrified by things like illness, aging, grief, death, mourning. We just want nothing to do with it. I mean, our society really tells us run like hell from those things. Like hospitals are creepy. People who are mourning are uncomfortable. Don't, you're going to say the wrong thing. Illness, aging, no. Our tradition actually says the exact opposite. Jewish tradition is very clear that, you run right to those spaces. You run to that hospital bedside. You get your body there. You run to that shiva, that funeral. You sit and be radically present with that person in, what are known as thin spaces. Right? These are these spaces, these moments when the boundaries between heaven and earth, life and death kind of thin out, and they're really disorienting. And our tradition says that you need to be accompanied by a loving community in those moments. And, chaplaincy just allows me and other chaplains to provide this really radical kind of presence and that's often something that our patients are missing. I have patients they are dying, right? I volunteered on an oncology floor. There's no getting around that. And yet their families are saying like, keep fighting, stay strong, be optimistic, and they're just alone in it. And then I come in and I'm like, you are dying. That is what's happening right now. Like, how do you feel about that? Where are you with that? And they're like, it's just like this moment where it's like, oh, this woman is not going to freak out or like cheer me on. Like I can actually be present with what is actually happening at this moment rather than resisting it, pushing it away, denying it. Anyway, I think a lot about a patient I once had who I went to talk to him and he just said to me, I'm done. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm getting these treatments that are giving me a week, a month. I'm just suffering. I'm in pain. I want this to be over. And I said, like, okay, I hear you. Like, it sounds like you're ready to die. That's what I'm hearing. He's like, yes, I am ready to die. If I didn't wake up tomorrow, I would be thrilled. And I said, like, okay, let's talk about that. Like, what would that look like? What do you need? Like, tell me more. And we just talked about it. And he was like, thank you for not telling me to not say that or saying to be strong. Like, you're just like the only person who was actually just listened to me. And then, a doctor came in to see him. So I stepped out and I told him I'd come back in a couple of hours. And when I tried to come back in a couple of hours, my boss just popped up from a stairwell and like grabbed me by the shoulder and actually steered me away from his room. And I was like, I'm sorry, what are we doing here? And he said, like, okay, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but the patient just coded and died about an hour ago. I thought, like, wow, I was one of the last people that that guy talked to, and he was heard, right? Like, I actually heard him, and I've failed plenty of patients. I've made plenty of mistakes, like that I, don't think me particularly great as a chaplain, but just in that moment of the most basic presence, the most basic, just being with what is actually arising, not what we wish was arising, not what we hope is arising, but what is actually arising with compassion and kindness. It did make a difference for him. And it was a very, it's a real privilege and a gift to get to do this work.
Mm. Um, there's a couple of questions that came in that I want to give a chance for you to answer,
Sure.
give you a chance to answer, I should say. Um, some lovely compliments also, people like your book,
Great.
who are here. But one question I want to, there was a question here. It's an interesting one. Why are Jews seen as a single entity like the Borg? That's a Star Trek reference.
Wow.
Well, first
Yeah.
of all, do you accept that premise?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
second, if so, yeah, how do you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating question. I don't necessarily know if I could answer that question of like why do other people see us that way, but I kind of like it actually. And the reason I like the idea of us being seen as a single entity, one that is extraordinarily diverse in every possible way, facet you can imagine, is because I think that we sadly, in our effort to join the modern world, we made ourselves into this Protestant style of religion, which was a terrible category error because Jews are not just a religion. Any of us who are Jewish on this Zoom can reject every aspect of Jewish religion and tradition, and we are still Jews. Nor are we a race or an ethnicity. Look around at Jews. A lot of races, a lot of ethnicities. So that's certainly not true. So what are we? I think we are something like the Edomites, the Hittites, the Ammonites. We're a tribe, but those don't really exist anymore. We are a civilization, a nation, a peoplehood, but I think most of all we're a family. And I think that's a struggle for us it's a struggle to be part of this category because it's not modern, it's not on the census form, it's very easy to misunderstand. But I do think Jews are a single entity, actually. I did that entity is a peoplehood, a family. Within that entity, I mean, man, anything goes. I don't think you can make any general statements about the Jews or Jews. My God, we are 16 million entirely different people, but we are a part of a story. We are a family or a peoplehood. And I actually love what Amos Oz and Fania Salzberger say about Jews in their beautiful book, Jews and Words. They say ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. And look, you're no more or less a Jew if you know or engage with that text line than anyone else. But I do think that we are a peoplehood that shares this text line. And I think that text line is in many ways our home. It is what we can continue to return to no matter how differently we practice or think or live or look. That is our shared home. And we can disagree and fight about it and reject it and accept it. And that's part of it. But I'm actually okay with us being an entity,
Hmm.
and that entity being a peoplehood or a family.
Hmm. There's another question that came in that says, this is from Julie. It says, there are times when, as you alluded to, people do come to your back from your back, sorry, to be harmful, like you mentioned. I appreciate mindfulness and trying not to be reactive, but it's impossible for me to feel grounded and safe when I perceive real threat with certain situations involving anti-Semitism. The
Yeah.
fear is real, and like the older family members I grew up with, I struggle with feeling secure,
Yeah.
nor should I feel that way. And so I wonder how you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the goals of my book was to ungaslight Jews about their fears. I think that many of us have been gaslit and told what you're seeing is not really anti-Semitism. You're overreacting. Your fear is not warranted. It is actually wrong. You're misunderstanding me. That's not true. This is real. And I was struck in just recent days, you know, looking at some of our liturgy about there's a lot of mentions of enemies in our liturgy, right? Which you would think, well, that's not spiritual. That's not, warm and fuzzy. No, that's called real life for Jews for
Mhm.
thousands of years, right? That's real life. It's in our liturgy. This is what we have dealt with. And, we had this beautiful vacation for history, many of us for a few decades in America, and I loved it. The 90s, awesome. That was a blip. And now we're back to being Jews again. And I think, I'll speak for myself. I think I really did kind of buy that I was an American of the Jewish faith. And I think some of my siblings in Israel bought the idea that they were Israelis, but we're Jews, right? Like this is kind of the condition. And I do think it's a little bit different now that we have a state. I do think actually, when I start to get really afraid and anxious, I think about my bubby, my grandmother, who was born in 1912. And for the first 36 years of my bubby's life, there was no Israel. So when, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there was brutal anti-Semitism in America, very, very scary, threatening anti-Semitism. And she is watching her relatives in Europe being murdered. There was nowhere to go. Right? America was the new Zion. It was the refuge, and it didn't feel so safe back then. And so I just think, like, how did my bubby sleep at night? Like, it's not even a rhetorical question. Really, how did she sleep at night? Honestly, I sleep fine tonight. I sleep fine at night because I do think it matters that we have a state. I do think it matters that we have an army and nuclear weapons. And I know maybe that doesn't feel spiritual and mindful and all of that, but nor does some of our liturgy. And I think there is a reality here, and it's a hard reality. And I wish it were different. And I wish there were enough of us that we could personally go and talk the billions of haters out of their hate. But there are 16 million of us. We're a neighborhood in Shanghai. Like that's the Jewish people, and being so vastly outnumbered, they're real threats. And we also have some real safety that 2,000 years of our ancestors didn't have. So I think that should give us some comfort. But I don't think your fears are unreasonable. I think they're very, very well warranted, and I share them. So I hope that, I don't know, I hope you feel seen and you feel acknowledged, because I really, as you'll see in my book, I feel the same way.
So we're coming up on the last section here. I want to give you a chance to read a little bit. I was moved by the end of the book in particular. So there's a passage beginning on page 281 until the end, and yeah, I just want to invite you to open that up
Yeah,
and share that with us. And
sure.
then I have a question when you get to the
Yeah.
end. We'll do a reading.
So this is the very end of my book, and it follows a passage about how Jews have always been. Well, we're different. To be a Jew is to be different. It says, "I'm not naive. I know plenty of people today will continue to find our difference intolerable. This will be painful, especially when they're people we once thought of as friends or at least allies. But I take heart in the story of Jews who took risks and endured hardships that make anything I might face seem like minor inconveniences. I think often of the story of one such group of Jews who were living in the Soviet Republic of Georgia in the late 1960s. Yearning to move to Israel, which was prohibited at the time, they did something unthinkable. They wrote a public letter to the United Nations and the Israeli government asking them to pressure Soviet officials to let them emigrate. The move was brazen in a way that nearly defied comprehension, the scholar Isabella Toporowski writes, since a gathering of three people could be viewed as an anti Soviet conspiracy. Three Jews was something even worse, a Zionist conspiracy. Nonetheless, all 18 of these Jews signed their real names to the letter and added their addresses too. They wrote, they say there are only 12 million Jews in the world, but he errs who believes that there are only 12 million of us. For with those who pray for Israel are hundreds of millions of those who did not live to this day, who are martyred, who are no longer with us. They march with us in the same column, unvanquished and immortal, they who transmitted to us traditions of struggle and faith. That is why we want to go to Israel. None of us is alone. We are always accompanied in some way by our ancestors and each other. And then I'll just do this quickly. I spoke at a conference at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point that included cadets from all five branches of the U.S. military, these young students. And I said, on the morning of the event, two Jewish cadets drove to my hotel to pick me up, one of whom informed me that he was fifth generation military. Members of his family had been serving since World War I. Pulling to the campus building where the event would be held, I caught sight of an icon of the Ten Commandments affixed to the side, and I realized it was a synagogue. As the cadets escorted me to the sanctuary, we passed by a wall of names. Every Jew to graduate from West Point dating back to Simon M. Levy, class of 1802. Ma'am, our names will be on there too when we graduate, a Jewish cadet proudly informed me. There was also a display featuring Jewish members of the armed forces who had been awarded the Medal of Honor, starting with Abraham Cohn, recognized for his service in the Civil War. At one point, I stepped out of the sanctuary to spend a few minutes gazing at those Jewish names on the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a cadet wearing a crisp white dress whites and a yarmulke walking toward me. As he passed through a doorway, he reached out, touched the mezuzah affixed to its frame, and then kissed his hand, an old Jewish custom. When he caught sight of me, he smiled. Ma'am, he said, nodding his head in acknowledgement. Everywhere you go at West Point, there are portraits and photos of soldiers from the past, many wearing their signature gray uniforms. At the end of the day, the cadet who organized the conference spoke about being part of this long gray line. Generations of heroes before them who put their country first and sometimes paid with their lives. I marveled at how these brave young people carry their ancestors, Jewish and American, with them, and how they embody the very best of both. The Jewish students I met at Campus Hillels, those Soviet Jews, those Jewish warriors, the many Jews who have been my teachers, mentors, and friends, and many more whose stories I know only through the pages of books, they inspire me to live proudly, gratefully, and joyfully as a Jew.
So that's how you close the book. So now,
Yes.
spoiler alert, that's how it ends.
Spoiler alert.
But but I was really struck by I think that I assume this was a conscious choice. You're trying to remind us that Jewish life, like all of life, is actually an embodied practice. Like,
Yes.
you're showing these images of people who, put their bodies on the line, right? And that Judaism isn't just an aesthetic exercise. It's not just a lifestyle choice or an intellectual exercise, which means that the stakes on some level are always existential.
Yes.
Um, so, do I have that right? And if I do, how do you think that living Judaism as a mindfulness practice can help us?
Yeah. As you were saying existential, I was like, hmm. But now actually I really think you're right. I do think what we're dealing with is existential. And I think something that I'm struggling with is that I think sometimes we get a little too theoretical. I think I see this manifesting in, a certain way of thinking that says like, we are meant to live in diaspora. Like we are a diasporic people. We should be diasporous. That having a state is wrong and bad. It's not our most beautiful and natural way of living. And I think the idea is that for centuries in diaspora, we built such beautiful communities, such rich cultures. We were thriving, and that's really the best way for us to be. And, in theory, I really understand that argument. And in practice, I think there's some truth to it, right? Like we did build these amazing communities and lives and cultures, and they were diverse and exciting, and we were really resilient, but just, we were also murdered by the millions and brutally assaulted and discriminated against. And, my problem with this beautiful theory is that Jews have bodies. Jews have bodies, and our bodies matter. In our tradition, they are not seen as degraded carnal meat envelopes for our souls. They're seen as sacred. Just read the Torah. A lot of stuff in there about our bodies and how sacred and precious and holy they are. And, I just like gently point out that we would never say to any other historically oppressed minority group, hey, you did so well under conditions of brutal oppression. I mean, look, it was tough, but you built these thriving communities and institutions and you built movements and you were so brave and resilient. So let's undo all those civil rights laws and go back. Like that's so beautiful. Like we would never say that would never occur to us. And I think that, I think our mindfulness practice of being embodied, it gets us out of the world of just beautiful theory and really into the world of our beautiful bodies. And I think that is so important with the challenges we're facing today. And I want to just, returning to Julie's, I think, really important question. The reason we're scared is because we have bodies, right? We care about those bodies. We value those bodies. We don't degrade them or say they don't matter or say there's some spirit realm that's really the important realm and this world doesn't matter. This world does matter. Our tradition values this world, this body, this life. And I think our mindfulness tradition can help us, can give us help us unlock our own homes. It can help us be in our own bodies and treasure this incredible gift of life that we've been given. So, that's why, Josh, I think you're right. It is existential. It is embodied. I think all of that is really true, and it's why I'm so grateful for the work that IJS is doing.
Mm, thank you. That's a good place to close. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to thank everybody who was here. Lisa, our ASL interpreter, thank you for being with us. Thank you to Harry Gilboa, who is behind the scenes, as well as to Marianne, and thank you to everybody for rolling so easily when we had a little tech snafu at the beginning, and it was great. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. There's some really good ones that we couldn't get to, but we hope you'll join us again in March when with Angela Buchdahl. And please, if you haven't already, buy Sarah's book, which is right there. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Good night.